This is a figure, a sculpture that was found in early Europe, and one of the things that they have discovered is that many of the sculptures of early Europe show various African types. In fact, 55,000 years ago, according to 3 labs, the University of Oxford, the University of Hawaii, the University of California at Berkeley have come to the conclusion that there are no people on the earth 55,000 years ago who are not black Africans.
One thing that is indubitably clear is that Africa is the cradle of the entire human race. From 4 million years ago all the way up to 200,000 years ago, the stepwise sequence leading in an evolutionary progression from early pre-human hominid ancestors all the way up to modern human beings occurred in Africa and Africa alone. Not that there weren't any migrations out of Africa, but those migrations did not have any impact on human evolutions leading up to modern human beings until after our human beings in fact left Africa. Now, what do I mean by that? A man by the name of Wainscott from England has said is that all of the populations around the globe are descendants from small founder populations that left Africa probably no later than 100,000 years ago. This means that, as C.W. Stringer has said, that all 6.5 billion people on this planet are Africans under the skin. Because if we go back far enough, everyone has
Africans with jet black faces once walked the earth all alone, no other races, until they traveled to the other lands colder than the motherland, and then the cross began.
Superiority or inferiority. And so for approximately how many years was the world populated exclusively and only by Africans, black Africans? Okay, black skin. You're talking about the modern, the last African, okay, because you see, the African is not only the first hominid, he's also the first human. Okay, the hominid is not completely human like us, but then comes the first human with our brain case, that's also African. And this begins to change about 55,000 years ago in Europe, where you get Africoid types becoming Caucasoid types.
African.
But what's important is that when Kemet appears in the human record, it appears in 3100 BC with a fully developed civilization. Writing was already in place, astronomy was already in place, they already had the 365-day year calendar and 1 quarter for the leap year and all of that. That calendar had actually been put in place around 4236 BC. So we're talking about a fully developed, high technical civilization.
It's true.
The powers in the knowledge.
Determine the circumference of the Earth unless you had, of course, presupposed that the Earth was round. We want to point that out. All of the mathematics that we study today has its roots in Africa. We can start off simply with counting. The very first or the oldest known artifact in mathematics is the Ashango bone. That's over 8,000 years old. It's from the Congo. That's found in Africa. If we go ahead, they had developed fractions. Furthermore, they had developed algebra and, of course, geometry, trigonometry, and it even gone as far as the roots of integral calculus. And this is all before Europe existed.
To the pyramid. The descending passage was precisely aligned to the North Pole star that was in place 3,350 years BC, and it used to shine down to the grotto into a pool of water, and of course it's only in that place once every 26,000 years. The so-called ventilating shaft of the King's Chamber oriented exactly to Orion in the southern heavens, and the one from the Queen's Chamber is oriented exactly to Sirius, also in the southern heaven. There has never been anything like it in the world. Nothing. Do you know the other thing about the Great Pyramid? Where the Great Pyramid sits, if you were to take all the longitude, there are 360 degrees of longitude around the Earth, right? The longitude of the Great Pyramid goes through more landmass than any other longitude in the world. The latitude of the Great Pyramid, going right through the Great Pyramid, goes through more latitudinal landmass than any other latitude in the world. So the Great Pyramid, from the point of view of land, is the center of the Earth. This is the reason why that not only in Egypt, but in Greece, Rome, Palestine, India, and China, build their cities in fixed intervals to the Great Pyramid. This is problem number 51, which gives you the formula for finding the area of a triangle, 1/2 base times height. So where this is relatively basic geometry. Next slide, please. But problem number 56 is something else. Problem number 56, let me see if I can, actually, it might be better if I put my glasses on and actually read this a little bit. Yes. Problem number 56 in the Rin Mathematical Papyrus, that's the one you see up there, seeks to find the slope of a pyramid whose height is 250 cubits and whose base is 360 cubits. The answer is 5 1/25 palms for each cubit in height, representing the cotangent of the angle of the slope of the pyramid's face. Now, if you've got a cotangent, if you can find cotangents, you know the way you can find tangents is that you flip the cotangent over. It's the inverse of a tangent. The other thing, too, just look at that. Imagine that that pyramid is three-dimensional, because that's what it's supposed to be. Now, all you really have to do is inscribe a triangle inside that pyramid, a right triangle whose height is also the same as the height of the pyramid. Therefore, the face becomes the hypotenuse, and half of the pyramid's base becomes the base of that right triangle, and then the height of the pyramid becomes the height of the right triangle. When you have all that in place, and it's really just a matter of drawing it in, you then can find sine and cosine. So now, if they have the tangent and cotangent and the ability to find sine and cosine, by definition, they have trigonometry. Now, the reason why I make that point is because every historian of science tells you that trigonometry wasn't invented until Hipparchus did 1,500 years later. Now, you see, we're not just talking about rudimentary calculation. We are now moving into the realm of higher mathematics, the foundation of all mathematics. Next slide, please. They even describe, you see, when a red giant explodes to contract down a white dwarf, that is a nova explosion. It lights up the sky. The Dogon described that. The connections between white dwarfs and supernovas weren't even known until 1914. The Dogon even described matter being made up of incredibly small spinning particles, i.e. atoms. They describe all of the constellations of being composed of countless of stars spinning in space as galaxies. They describe the 4 moons of Jupiter, and these people, to all intents and purposes, don't have even a system of writing that we know about. At least not one that anyone has ever discovered.
Point to the fact that the calendar we use today is derived from the Egyptian. They were the first people to invent the second of time, the second of art, the hour, the minute. Their astronomical observations over many years produced these ideas, these precise quantities and volumes and times and standards which were later to dominate the world. The Babylonians did not have any proper calendar. The Egyptians had the 365 1/4 days. 1,500 years before Christ. Africans Everything is an echo and echo and echo. They haven't even begun to question the basics in this civilization. As Dr. Diop has shown, that a great deal of the Greek science, and we're not attacking the Greeks, because they had their own genius too, but the basis, all these things they claim, you see, Hippocrates, taking sections out of the work of earlier Egyptian writers without giving any credit to them at all. Pythagoras, the Pythagorean theorem was worked out long ago. Pythagoras spent 7 years, some people say 22, in Egypt. And he comes back with all this, even medical theories, and brings it all back to Greece and all the claim. All the great European scholars went to Africa. Thales of Miletus, Democritus, Pythagoras, Eudoxus. There's a whole list of them walking into Africa, picking up things from astronomy, geometry, medicine, etc., and going back home and claiming it to be theirs. Father of this and father of that, when they're the children.
The oldest rendering of a boat was also found in Kemet and was said to have been painted over 5,000 years ago. This 132-foot ship is one of the oldest boats ever discovered. It was with vessels such as this that the king Ka-Keper-Ren Senrosret I crossed the Mediterranean Sea and founded the city of Athens in Greece around 1897 BCE.
When you go and look at their medicine, I spoke in Atlanta to the Center for Disease Control. Africans had aspirin before us. They were using Salix capensis, which is salicylic acid, the main active ingredient in aspirin. They were using tetracycline 14 centuries ago in Nubia. They found the yellow-green flash of tetracycline in Nubian bones 14 centuries ago. They only started using that antibiotic in America in the 1950s. They pioneered in several operations. They pioneered in the cesarean operation. Dr. Finch has written a fine thing on the cesarean. At the time when that operation was experimental in Europe, people like Dr. Felkin went into Africa and observed the Banyoro surgeons performing the cesarean, and the mother was hale and hearty after 4 or 5 days. No woman survived the cesarean in Europe. And they observed the operation, the way they stitched, the way they opened the belly, the kind of instruments they used. They observed they were using one of the instruments, the cautery iron, with such fantastic skill. It was very minor tissue damage that caused great ruptures in the European hospitals. They found that Africans were using both anesthetics and antiseptics in their operating theaters at that time, when in Europe, Lister only introduced antiseptics 2 years earlier than the witness of this operation, which the witness said must have been going on for quite a while, because the Africans were performing with routine skill what was then experimental surgery. And yet the fragments exist, so significant that we have 10 major medical texts in African languages. The first medical texts in the world are in African language. The first mathematical papyri, which you saw this morning, that's African. Those are the first. Even today, with all the destruction, we could still go back to the African documents and show them on a screen. The Ebers papyrus, the Edwin Smith papyrus, the Smith papyrus, which is 1500 BC. They have chapters on helminthiasis, ophthalmology, gynecology, pregnancy diagnosis, circulation of the blood, the pulse, diagnostic percussion, all that, chapters, intestinal disease and all that 1,500 years before Christ in Europe, the 1870s, none.
Seven wonders of the world. This magnificent structure stands as tall as a 45-story building and is comprised of nearly 2.5 million stone blocks, which weigh an average of 2.5 tons each. This one building is comprised of enough stone to make 30 Empire State Buildings. The temple complex of Ipet-i-Sut, now called Karnak, was one of the greatest accomplishments ever achieved in Kemet. It is comprised of numerous temples, one of which contains the largest colonnaded hall ever constructed. This great hall consists of 136 columns, which stand in 16 rows. The tallest columns are 69 feet high and are large enough to accommodate a group of 100 men standing on its apex. This one room has enough floor space to equal the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, and the entire complex is large enough to accommodate all of the churches built in London since the birth of Jesus the Christ.
Egypt is the oldest and the most highly developed technical civilization in the history of humanity.
From which flowed
the civilizations throughout the rest of the world.
And in terms of achievements,
whoever developed Kemet or Egypt is responsible for the initial leadership in civilizing the world, laying the groundwork for civilization throughout the world. That's right.
And specifically, we're talking in areas of what? Mathematics?
We're talking mathematics, astronomy, we're talking chemistry. Chemistry, for example, is named after Kemet. It comes from chem, or chemistry. We're talking religion, we're talking philosophy, we're talking all genre of literature, such as the epic play, the poem, everything, the arts and the sciences, grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, astronomy, geometry, and music, what have you. All of these reach their perfection in Kemet, and then were transmitted throughout the rest of the world.
Because in Africa,
Imhotep was called the son of Ptah. This brother was a multi-genius. He's the first brother to come down to us in history and recorded history as a multi-genius. You heard about Michelangelo and Bernini, and you heard about Alberti. You heard about all those European so-called geniuses, but never do you hear about African genius. No one talks about the African genius, especially the first genius in recorded history, which is this brother, the ancient sage Imhotep. And you can see by his nose and his mouth, he doesn't look like Charleston Heston or Yul Brynner. He's no offspring of Elizabeth Taylor. Looking at his nose and lips, you can see that he looks just like your uncle. Looks like anybody you see here sitting in the room. Clearly showing you Imhotep is clearly an African. And this brother was the grand vizier, a vizier, under the pharaoh Zoser in the third dynastic period in Egypt, which is approximately 3,000 years BCE. Nearly 5,000 years ago, this brother walked on the face of the earth and was recorded as being a genius. This brother designed the first monumental stone structure known to man, the step pyramid for King Zoser. Now you heard about the seven wonders of the world, the light tower of Alexandria, and you heard about the hanging tower of Babel and the Rhodes statue and all the other stuff. You can't find any of it. It's all gone. But yet, one of the wonders, the pyramids of Egypt, are still there. The only wonders of the world that you don't have to wonder about are still there in Kemet.
Startling among the West Africans in the 13th century AD, about 7 centuries ago. They found Africans were plotting an invisible star, Sirius B. Sirius A is a bright star we all see in the night sky. Sirius B is impossible to see with the naked eye. It is impossible to see it with the naked eye. It has a magnitude of about 8.5. And the Africans not only saw it, they plotted its orbit and trajectory right up to the end of the 20th century, up to the year 1990. And the diagram produced by our best astronomy today is identical with what they produced centuries ago. We only became aware of that star towards the end of the 19th century.
So again, why are we afraid to be engineers?
Kenti, K-A, we kind of write it out, K-H-E-N-T-I, Kenti. It's also their word for first, or chief, or up. So for them, the first land, or the chief land, or even the origin land is the South, because that's where they came from, the South, okay? Now, they always said that their, what do you want to call it? Their sacred land, or the land of the Netters, Ta-Neter, the Ta-Neteru, the land of the gods. Some people say it was what we call Punt. Punt would have been Somalia. And the others say it's actually might have been Uganda or the Great Lakes region of Africa. recently, in the last 2 months, they have done mitochondrial DNA studies on several Egyptian mummies, and they found something very interesting. Their DNA is the same as the people that you find in Uganda today. It's Ugandan DNA in mummies that are 4,000 years old.
Wow.
Okay? So it becomes absolutely absurd. It's beyond absurd. It's almost, if you think of it as a cultural war, it's almost like Holocaust denial, you know.
Archaeology's discovery of an African presence in America, an academician, Sanarov, from one of the Soviet science cities, wrote me to talk about the various work that the Russians had been doing in this connection. They were dealing with Pacific connections while I was dealing with the Atlantic connections, and a dialogue began, and they informed me that one of their scientists, Volosimo, had discovered perfectly ground spherical crystal lenses in ancient Egypt, indicating that the Africans had telescopes. Galileo suggested the ancients had telescopes. He wasn't believed. Galileo used the African water clock in his experiments. Many of us like to make noise today about colored people's time. There's no such thing. That is slave time. These are the things where we start to glorify incompetence, to glorify inefficiency. The Africans were remarkable in those times because they were the best in their field. They strove for excellence. Not everyone can be excellent, but you have to strive for it. It has to be an ideal. You don't just take for granted because you've been beaten down in a society, in a culture, in a period of time, that you must aspire to the worst in that society because that is what is expected of you. What they expect of us is their bloody business. It is what we expect of ourselves.